Rohingya state in northern Rakhine. We call Prime Minister to open the debate. I'll be timing.
For too long, we as an international community, or we as a species, have stood by and watched the persecution of ethnic groups and religious groups while they live within states that are allowed to strip away their rights, strip away their futures, and destroy everything that is meaningful and valuable in their lives. Our world exists again at a crisis point, where we see the Rohingya people are being persecuted, pushed from their homes, pushed onto boats where they have no futures at the end of them, if they even make it that far. And we are finally going to take a stand. We're going to defend that identity. We're going to invest heavily in making sure that the Myanmar government is unable to be the slow-acting poison that strangles away the future of the Rohingya people. 5-point model for this speech. First, we would tell you that we're going to establish it around the current Rakhine state, and we're going to make sure that whatever facilitation is necessary to make sure those borders are ingrained for the long term are perfectly fine. We're happy to consult with the people who are in existence and who they think that land culturally exists to. The second thing we do is we're going to have a massive amount of international military power that is going to go in and establish peace. We're perfectly happy with having UN peacekeepers and the UN Security Council be at the forefront of this, as well as volunteer troops from any country who wishes to provide them. Third, we're going to create humanitarian corridors, both by air, ship, and land, to make sure that both the facilitation of the Rohingya people into this state, as well as the outsourcing of any military or other ethnic groups that might be in that region, are leaving. We think that we have precedent with this in Syria, and we're perfectly happy to establish new precedent to make sure that the people can go to the places where they thus belong. Fourth, what we're going to do is treat any action by Myanmar's government as an act of war. We are going to treat that provocation like violence against the international community. We will isolate and exile that community and go to war with them. Fifth and finally, I'll take you at the end of this as this clarification. Fifth and finally, we're going to allow and keep troops there, or peacekeepers there, towards the facilitation and building up of a government. And until we, with reasonable confidence, and that may be the next 100 years, reasonable confidence that the state is safe and is going to be able to exist into the future. Did you still have clarification? 2 points in this speech. First, we're going to talk about the immediate protection of the Rohingya people, and second, we're going to talk about the long-term survival of this identity. We think the framing in this round is very clear. We're going to talk about who gets the best results for the Rohingya people. What they have to do on opposition is both prove how they do not allow the extinction of this identity and these people, and how they are going to be somehow represented and have futures if they want some sort of multi-ethnic state, or they could say why they don't think these people deserve to exist, but we hope they don't do that. Two things in this speech. First, on immediate protection. We think first and foremost the security and lives of these individuals is fundamental. When Aung San Suu Kyi can get on and say half of the Rohingya structures have been not tampered with, which is just euphemism for the destruction of half of the structures of an entire people, we tell you there is a problem. When they get on and have persecution, constantly refusing to allow human rights investigators even in to see what is happening. We must trust satellite imagery to see what is going on in this country, to see fires burning down villages and people being scorched to death. We would tell you there is a problem. When these Malaysian or boats to Malaysia mean that if you even make it there, you have no future, you have no citizenship, and you have no life, we would tell you there's a problem, and we're going to stop that. We think the immediate establishment of a state allows and functions for that. It creates the circumstances where you can actually have people create roots and have safety and actually not fear every night that they're going to be killed. If they can ever come up with outcomes on their side of the house that are more significant than that, I'm perfectly happy to hear them now.
The last time the international community attempted to invade a heavily forested and hilly region, we got the Vietnam War, which ended well for no one. What makes you think this intervention will be successful?
Okay, so if the Myanmar government is going to go so far as to treat themselves as being invaded, we think that there is a significant problem. We must do anything in our power to make sure that the Rakhine people, or the Rohingya people, have a future, and they have a future in their own territorial ground. We're perfectly happy to concede the international community is imperfect, whether that is Vietnam, or I imagine what a lot of opposition material is, UN peacekeepers in Congo, in Libya, in Syria. But we're happy to bite those harms because we allow for a future to exist. No matter what happens, we think that this stability and this facilitation of a state is necessary. Recognize that although India and Pakistan was a bloody conflict, the formation of those two states as a counterbalance was necessary to be treated as equals. The same is true for North and South Korea, or Kosovo and Serbia. We will tell you that the same is going to exist, as we will even bite the worst harm, like Israel and Palestine, and learn from our mistakes, because the reason that Palestine failed was because the United States was willing to back the Israeli government, the powerful government, rather than the people who actually need it. If we could rewrite history, we would have gone in and done the exact same thing for the Palestinian people. We're perfectly happy to make sure that the immediate protection of those individuals is held first and foremost. Secondly, though, let's talk about the long-term ability to survive, right? Because just simply saying that these people have somewhere to go, even though they become stateless or refugees and can start over their lives somewhere else, is insufficient. These are a people. These have lives. They have culture, and they have tradition. Let's talk specifically about how we get stability. First, we would tell you that actually allowing human rights investigators into a place allows for them to understand what sorts of problems need to go in there. Beyond that, though, we think there's a massive amount of support from NGOs and other organizations who see this as a humanitarian crisis and want to help, simply do not have the flows of capital because Myanmar is unwilling to allow them to go in there. Secondly, though, we would tell you that the borders and the existence means that they have the very basic standard of being able to enforce their own protection, right? Just being able to have a home when we were talking about issues like homelessness is the exact type of safety that it allows you an ability to decide your own future. Finally, though, we think that there are massive psychological harms by continuing to allow these individuals to exist in a state that does not recognize them as legitimate, that continues to persecute them, that continues to destroy and rip away their future. Two things that also come from stability. First, economic, and second, on a cultural, more representative side. We think that with stability in the long term, we can facilitate the creation and organization of an economy that's able to function. The comparative here is not the most beautiful economy that you could ever see. It's a comparative about being able to get a job, being formally recognized in the economy, being able to participate and pay taxes into a government that will ever give you those taxes back to you and has your welfare in mind. But secondly, though, we think that this is a large opportunity for the pivot to Asia, for the US and the UK. We're perfectly happy to make this a Western proxy if it requires us and allows us to be a place where these people can exist. We can see this happening in Israel and South Korea. We think that the Rakhine state has value in the creation of an economic zone, and we're perfectly happy to have the US and UK or any other Western country or non-Western country facilitate the trade to make sure that they are economically viable in the future. Finally, though, on cultural identity. We think a state means recognition. And with recognition, you get the support of the international community and the ability to advocate for your own needs. You get a seat at the UN to advocate your claims, and you have the ability for a government who is actually able to create and facilitate your interests. We think that that representation is something that can never come from power sharing, can never come from being a minority in a country that will never recognize your cultural identity or your specific historical identity. We think that the cultural practices being able to be practiced in public means you have a life and a future ahead of you. At the end of this debate, we need to take a stand against individuals who are, or countries who are willing to strip away the rights of others and take away any future for those cultural identities. Very, very proud.
We thank Prime Minister for the speech. We'd like to call the Leader of Opposition. Here he is.
So we're invading a country, and I have a lot to get through, so our policy be very clear. This is very expensive. We will take that money dollar for dollar and use that money to do some other different things. One, we will pay Myanmar to eventually give the Rohingya citizenship. But note, this money will be given to it in a stepped and gradated fashion. We will pay them, first of all, when they stop violence. We will pay them, secondly, when they stop attacking refugee camps. We will pay them, thirdly, when they establish clean water, safety, and education for these groups. And we will pay them an especially large lump sum, well and above the cost they need to do these things, if they give the Rohingya citizenship. If they don't do any of these things, we will instead impose sanctions. But we will also pay surrounding countries to establish refugee camps, which mean international standards already set out all sorts of conventions. So we will pay Malaysia to accept them. We will pay Bangladesh to accept them with a future date for transferal back to Myanmar. So this is our alternate policy. We agree that the current situation is horrific. We think this is a much better chance for success, and also we don't kill lots of people in the interim. I have one point of rebuttal I want to make before I move into my three substantives. Firstly, they say this is a pivot to Asia. You can't just say it's good by calling it a pivot, because the US is pivot to Iraq, or pivot to Vietnam. It's unpopular in the region, especially when Western interventionism, as espoused by groups like ASEAN, which are heavily non-interventionist, is the norm in the region. And the countries like China often say they are the ones who are willing to stand for the autonomy of states, where the US is not. There's a lot more on this. I can't cover it too little time. Stefan's going to do a great job, I hope. So, what's substantive, therefore? Why is it that we think this intervention, in the first instance, is going to lead to a huge loss of life and widespread devastation? Second point, the comparative, why ours is better. Thirdly, why the state you create is largely likely to be non-functional and they have a better future within Myanmar. Firstly, therefore, on intervention. Note that the military junta, which still controls Myanmar, which still constitutionally has a majority of seats in every legislative chamber, is not going to take this sitting down for several reasons. Firstly, northern Rakhine state is highly rich in natural resources, right? This is why the Burmese state has actually in the past oppressed other minorities, although it stopped more recently. Note, furthermore, in order for you to guarantee the sort of safe corridors for movement you say you want, you are going to have to control large swathes of territory in Myanmar, and not just the Rakhine state when you deal with the mass exodus of people fleeing war. But no, thirdly, this is a military junta. They're highly nationalistic. The only justification for them being in power is that they can defend the state against external aggressors. You have made their lie, they tell the Burmese people, true, because you have given them the specter of an entire international community, no thank you, trying to undermine the state. So there will be warfare. Why is it likely to be especially bloody and protracted? Several reasons. One, you are fighting in a region in which every single civilian on the ground who is not a Rohingya person is going to be against your invasion. That means ordinary civilians take up arms, especially when this is, for some groups of people, a very strong religious issue for them. Note that the key instigators of violence against the Rohingya have actually been monks. When you cannot differentiate between state forces and civilian forces fighting against you, you need to acknowledge the sort of massacres you saw happening in My Lai, in Vietnam, and all across, no thank you, the Cold War are inevitably going to happen again. Not least because it's impossible to fight the war effectively otherwise. I presume you're not going to resort to Agent Orange. Is that just a bad idea? I'll take you in a moment. Secondly, note that the conventional military resources of large states simply aren't applicable in these sorts of conflicts. Why? In heavily forested areas and hilly areas, drone strikes obviously do not work because, trees, leaves, that sort of stuff. Secondly, heavy artillery and armor simply cannot move through forested regions. This means you have a mass influx of infantry on a huge level, right? Infantry trained to believe they're fighting a war against people who are monsters, who are opposing the other side. This is not conditions for just war or bloodless war. What are the consequences? I'll take closer.
Sir, how can you explain to us why the military junta, if the stigma towards these Rohingya is so serious, why under the world these Myanmar government will accept your counter model?
That's a very good question, because things exist on the spectrum. Burmese junta has actually responded in the past to sanctions well. Note the bit when it became a kind of democracy, gave Aung San Suu Kyi quite a lot of power. So we know it responds to these sorts of things. Taking away approximately 25% of your upper half post-Irrawaddy region, which is especially rich in mineral resources, is a different kettle of fish. Territorial integrity matters to people in a way which sanctions do not. Right? Saying that the land our ancestors fought and died for is going to be given away is different from saying, if you do this, we'll not only not give you money, but we'll give you extra money if you obey. There's just no carrot on your side, for instance, right? So there's a difference here, there's a spectrum. So what does this mean? In other words, number one, lots of people died, right? Trivial, I wouldn't belabor this point. But secondly, this is problematic because the international community, when it intervenes, is especially susceptible to body bag factors, right? Countries are often only weakly invested in distant interventions in which they have no direct interest. When body bags start coming back, when those fill your airways, no thank you, civilians often ask for a rapid pull-out. And that's what we saw exactly happening in Iraq and in Vietnam, right? What this means is that the population which have now riled up to hate the Rohingya even more because they are responsible for the international community destroying our sovereignty, that retaliation gets a whole lot worse. Also, by the way, note that you're also going to get, while the conflict is going on, even more retaliation against the Rohingya, right? Like, I know 50% is horrible, there is still another 50% we're looking at, right? Note there's success right now. Under what we're doing right now, Aung San Suu Kyi has already for the first time in front of the G8, too late, we acknowledge that there is a problem and set up an inquiry. We think things are getting better. So, secondly, there's a comparative. First thing to note, right? In the status quo, things are getting better. Not only has Aung San Suu Kyi recognized this problem, but note that because Myanmar is now at least tentatively a democracy, there are future avenues available for the representation of people via ordinary democratic mechanisms. They say they are a minority. I point out that the Karens, Kachins, Shans, and Mons, other minorities in Myanmar, already have representation and a significant degree of autonomy. So it's unclear why this is no precedent of success. But no, furthermore, that your policy destroys any prospect of Myanmar remaining a democracy. Because now the same international community which supported you when you were becoming a democracy has removed your rights as a state and has come in to intervene again, and the military now again has become the sole body protecting you. This means you sentence all people in Myanmar to a brutal dictatorial regime. So even if we lose completely on the Rohingya, there's a large number of people you also sentence to living under a brutal regime. And also, as I've said, we think our policy of giving them incentives is going to work a lot better at saving these individuals' lives. Thirdly, therefore, let's talk about what was I going to talk about? Yeah, let's talk about how this is going to create a non-functional state. Basic things to know. Number one, no agricultural sustainable land, first of all. Secondly, they are going to rely on surrounding states for them to have trade with the international community, and even if they're formed, they will be sandwiched between two hostile states. This is not a recipe for a functional state, and they have a better future in Myanmar. Our policy is better. Happy to oppose.
The Leader of Opposition for the speech to continue the debate would like to call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Honorable Assembly, opening opposition concedes that there is a murderous regime loose in Myanmar, and their solution is to give them money and hope they don't use it to murder more people. We tell you that giving this regime money is not the type of reward for genocide that we are willing to embrace on government side of the House. We think genocide needs one response from the international community, and that response is an immediate end to that violence. I'm going to work through the speech we were just given backwards, prove why it has completely failed to fulfill its obligations in this round. Next, I'm going to talk about the types of violence that are actually occurring in Myanmar, how persecution will always occur when these minorities exist within the state, and do some comparative weighing at the end. On deconstruction now, he contradicts himself describing this state, first saying that it's resource rich, then saying that they have no arable land. Which is it? I'm pretty sure with Western support, they can build a sustainable economy. Then he tells us that we're going to change the incentives of this junta by giving them lots of money. I don't think that this is the case because they identified that it's religious entities that are driving a lot of this prosecution, not the military junta itself. We think that regime, being that it is invested in the international community and its members are rich and are harmed by things like sanctions or the fact that there is a country killing their troops, are far more likely to bow to international demands and are not going to want to go toe-to-toe versus the United States, the UK, and every other coalition partner. No. Moving further upon, they tell us that what they're going to do is, create essentially this state where the military junta is going to be given all this money so that they don't carry out these killings. The problem is that it's not, as they identified, the military junta that's doing all the killing. A lot of this is individual groups, neighbors killing neighbors, people within their own community burning down their Rohingya neighbor's house and driving them out because they are so incensed by religious violence. Those are the people that their money is never going to reach to because it's just going to the government. They need to prove why the Rohingya or the Myanmar government will put out like individual cash transfers, like we'll pay you $50 to not murder your neighbor. I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think it's enforceable if they do. Sure.
So you say we can easily observe this violence and the consequences on the ground, but then you say we can't enforce these cash transfers being used things they were given to be used for. Why can't we just make them retroactive payments, for instance?
Retroactive payments for not murdering people. Okay, we don't think that this is the best way that a state should function. But additionally, we tell you that it's much harder to control that money when it goes into the arms of a state that then can pass it through all the different bureaucratic back channels and get it to the people that it wants to, or keep it from the people that it wants to. How long has Iran been able to say it's been diluting its nuclear reactors when it really hasn't, or vice versa? The international community can never keep track of all that stuff, especially when it's money, which is an incredibly fungible resource. This money will never get to the people that it needs to, and all it's going to do is further empower this regime so they can stand back and allow neighbors to continue killing neighbors. We don't think they've offered any effective plan for these people. The best they can do is say, we're going to pay murderers and hope that they won't murder anymore. We don't think that's an effective policy. Moving into constructive material now. First, let's talk about the persecution that will always occur to these minorities within this state as long as they occur. Recognize the religious violence that they identified, right? This is an inexorable and unavoidable condition that is always going to exist. 5 reasons then specifically why this persecution is always going to occur within this state if the Rohingya remain a part of it. First, their minority status, literally less of them, prevents them from getting equity, right? They can't muster the voting shares to in any government get an equitable amount of representation or have any sort of representation in a power-sharing agreement. This dilutes their democratic power and makes it impossible for other groups to respect them. No. Second, the religious divides are deepened and are easy to blame when these groups are forced to coexist, and they can blame all of their problems on these religious divisions. We think that these are only deepened when you force them to live in close contact with one another, and the monks that you've identified are never encouraged to change their behavior because they're probably not going to be taking money from the government anyway because they're monks.
Hear, hear.
Third point, competition for resources and employment. No, we tell you that when these people are in competition for resources and employment with another, this breeds the type of hatred and rivalry that is more likely to incense this type of violence, especially in developing states that in many cases don't have enough jobs to go around for everyone. This is the type of everyday sort of violence and discrimination that is bred when people are forced to live side by side with one another. Fourth, we tell you that they're impossible to target for aid, right? Because it's impossible to know for sure exactly how bad things are behind the veil of the Myanmar state, right? We can't go into all these villages or send human rights investigators to all these villages. No, because it's very easy to do things like deny passports or falsify evidence or literally move the bodies from the village after the cleansing occurred. These are things that occur so we can never understand the full scope of the problem, and the Rohingya people are never able to make their case to the international community on how bad it actually is. And the final reason is that the bias towards state sovereignty that we all have contributes to the acceptance of atrocities on the global stage. How long were we willing to stand by and let Assad literally gas his people because he was in control of Syria, so we had to listen to him? We tell you that as long as the military junta is in charge of the Rohingya people, we are always going to defer to the junta's actions because that's the way the international community has functioned to work, state versus state. Until we are willing to stand up to that regime for the Rohingya people, there will never be any sort of justice for them. If closing has a point, I'll take them. Okay, opening.
So, you think that a policy in which you're going to invade a military junta, and when they only need to create body bags to send troops back home, is a conflict you will win clearly. Can you explain this for the first time?
Okay. We don't think that Myanmar is going to stand up against the entire might of the international coalition that vastly outclasses them militarily and can crush them economically with sanctions that you've already identified they've responded to in the past. We don't think it's in the interest of that state to destroy themselves and expend all of their resources fighting this international coalition. But even if these body bags are so harmful to the international community, we say maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that will show them the types of body bags that have already been coming out of Myanmar. The body bags for people that have been incredibly massacred on large scales, and we tell you that the international community needs to understand and realize how much death and destruction is happening in order to galvanize that action. It took us far too long with Syria. Maybe this time we can get it right. We think we're far more likely to get it right when we establish that international community and coalition from the get-go. Finally now, let's talk about comparative. What we get on our side versus their side. We tell you in the meantime, in the decades that it takes for us to track this money from the junta to the people who are actually murdering one another in villages, there are untold thousands and thousands of Rohingya people that are killed and are exiled from the country. That is a cost that is too high to bear. But even so, what is their best case scenario? In 40 years, if the junta keeps all this money and is excellent about it, we might get the Kurds in Turkey, where they are still hated, where they are still blamed for every problem in the state, where there is still violence in every election, and the leader goes on national television and says we need to eradicate these people, or we need to push them out of our state. On our side of the house, we get states like India and Pakistan that might be rivals still, but are far more capable of maintaining their own borders, far more capable of advancing their own sovereignty, and are forced to respect one another because they've developed and they have equitable militaries and economies. We get North and South Korea. We get India and Pakistan. It might not be perfect, but at least these people have a place that they can call home, a place where they are safe from the constant predation of government that doesn't recognize their existence, and we as the international community have fulfilled the obligation that we made when we gave Aung San Suu Kyi a peace prize and then stood by while she allowed the government to murder people. Incredibly proud of herself.
Hear, hear.
We thank Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. And we call Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Countries won't stand up against the overwhelming might of the Western world. I come from a place that was decimated by 55 years of communism, ended in 7 years of protracted civil wars, purportedly committed ethnic cleansing, stood against the overwhelming military might of the most powerful alliance in the world. Why? Nationalistic reasons. Countries like borders. Regimes like to stay in power. They are aware that wars make them stay in power and push back democracy. They are aware that they won't die, but someone else's children will die. They are able to foster nationalistic and religious sentiment in countries that are very isolated. This is what happened in Serbia in 1999. This is what happened in Iraq in 2003. These countries stood. They admittedly lost wars, but they did end up with protracted insurgencies, high levels of violence and ultimately failed states. It's unclear why that is a positive comparative. Rebuttal. First they say we are contradictory because we say they're rich in resources but also poor agriculturally. I challenge opening government to survive and subsist by eating coal. They will understand the difference. More importantly, what this means is that you end up being dependent on food, on water, on your immediate neighbors. What is the issue? One of your immediate neighbors is Myanmar. You have a coastline that is essentially underdeveloped, but surrounded by hostile states. You also have, and they can fear in the international community. What they can't fear then are other ASEAN states, which have shown strong support towards Myanmar in this issue, and countries like China, which try to differentiate itself from the Western international community by showing that it has respect for state sovereignty and the unwillingness to intervene in affairs of other countries. What this realistically means is not only that you end up being dependent on food and water or on international aid for decades, but it also means that it's difficult to form a sustainable state. Because note, minerals are bulky. They're really hard to export elsewhere. It's unlikely they'll be able to build a high-tech industry in the state. What this means is when you have an extractive state, what you largely do is export things elsewhere, mostly to neighboring countries. When again you're dependent on neighboring countries who are hostile to you, what this realistically means is that you end up in a situation where you're essentially dependent on international aid and therefore unlikely to develop sustainable democratic institutions. They tell it'll be really hard to control where this money goes to. If they can fiat in an intervention in one of the most inhospitable places in the world for armies, we can presumably fiat in a few international monitors that are able to go to villages and check whether violence is happening. I would posit this is easier than sending dozens of battalions into villages and stopping violence from happening. At that point, you can make payments retroactive. Even if the government doesn't engage in violence, but there is still violence on the ground, you can condition payment on government stopping said violence from happening. Presumably, if we are able to control for this, if we are able to control for an international intervention, we have the resources and manpower to do the same on our side of the house. And they do actually acknowledge that there are issues like, oh, you can't send people into villages. At that point, we question once again the efficacy of their policy. Considering the analysis Ashish provides, they never respond to other than saying, oh no, the regime won't go against strong military forces, which I disprove, and Ashish also implicitly disproves. What this essentially means is that all the harms we present in the first speech essentially stand. Massive body bags, not only of Western soldiers, which means you're more likely to end up with more aggression, like people shooting randomly at civilians, i.e. Fallujah, but also you're more likely to end up with attacks against the civilian population, both the Rohingya and non-Rohingya one, less likely to end up with sustainability, also destroying even the feeble infrastructure that already exists in the status quo, making the state even less sustainable. But also, note that as horrible as the Myanmar regime is, there is still a large level of population that lives there, which will also suffer as a result of this policy. While being possibly less important than the Rohingya, they should still not be entirely discounted. The fact that you will effectively destroy an entire country, kill and murder dozens of thousands of individuals, is probably something that should be weighed on a comparative. And when the comparative is your intervention will be futile, it's probably something that's worth weighing for our side. One other thing I would like to note is, even though this is a religious conflict, precedent exists. Groups like the Korens are Christians, yet are still able to get a degree of minority right in Myanmar. What does this prove for us? One, that it is eventually possible to overcome religious conflict, but note that warfare makes them far worse and more entrenched. But secondly, that the government itself is able to show a level of pragmatism in dealing with minority groups, provided other incentives, like the significant monetary incentives you get on our side. So essentially, what this means is that you end up with a country destroyed for no particularly good reason. I will take closing if they have a POI to offer. No, opening, go.
Okay. Given that Christians and Buddhists haven't had the same rivalry that Muslims and Buddhists had, I think this is much more comparable to India and Pakistan, which would have forced those states to remain together and allowed that violence to continue even to the present day.
I don't really know whether it was worth the millions of casualties in much more than two wars, but two big wars. It's probably a comparison that's difficult to make considering the counterfactual isn't 100% clear. But you still don't disprove, other than claiming there are historical reasons. There are historical reasons for many conflicts. It doesn't disprove the argument, and it doesn't disprove the strong monetary incentives you get on our side. After that, the response Ashish provides to the POI from closing, which is that the junta itself is able to think on a spectrum, therefore be more reasonable when it comes to dealing with financial issues compared to dealing with open warfare. Lastly, on democratic consensus. The first thing I want to point out here is that as a result of this policy, even at their very best, where you for some reason assume that it will be efficacious at a point, at the very least, based on the analysis of how this intervention will look like, we can assume that it will not be overnight. It is not Iraq where you can easily conquer a country. It is a place where you necessarily have to put infantry in. While the status quo is terrible, what is likely is that it becomes even worse at a point at which you know you are getting an intervention because of an ethnic group. You know that you can't get soldiers immediately to areas where the Rohingya live. You're likely to end up with massacres on a much higher scale as well as genocide, which makes your policy worse. Secondly, to the extent they care about democratic representation, we will point out that at a point at which this is essentially a client state that is unable to be independent, you're never likely to end up with the democratic institutions. At least on our side, there is a possibility of inclusion and autonomy down the line. There is no such possibility on theirs. Very proud to oppose.
Alright, we thank Deputy Leader of Opposition for the speech. To open the closing half of the debate, we'd like to call Member of Government.
Let's move to another debate. In my speech, I'm going to talk about two things. Essentially, I'm going to talk about why statehood. Second, I'm going to answer the question of why international community in this regard. Whereas in the upper half of the debate, the main focus or the main dialogue in the upper half is about like which alternative, like either paying this military junta or really creating the state will eventually help this Rohingya community. We think that from closing government, we think that the yardstick to judge today's debate is not only to, of course, to protect the interests of the Rohingya community as a whole, but we think that the yardstick is not only start on that level, but we think that the better yardstick to judge today's debate is whether or not this policy, by having a state, can we really benefit other stakeholders in today's debate, i.e. like the Myanmar's government or even like the neighboring countries as a whole. But before that, let me first, my rebuttals were really integrated to my argument. I'll first answer the question of why we believe that international community, why we think that international community, presumably to be the Western countries, are important in today's debate. We think that the characterization of Myanmar proposed to you by opening opposition is not correct. We don't think that Myanmar does have the incentive to really go to war or even to engage in further conflict, given the fact that they have been engaging in conflict for like several decades. And the government has just been democratized or transitioned to a new phase. We think that the incentive of the Myanmar government is that, of course, they do not of course they want stability on one hand, but on the other hand, we don't think that these Rohingya, these Myanmar government do want to keep this Rohingya community within their own territory. But then the question here is to what extent or in what way can we help these can we help this Rohingya community on one hand, but on the other hand, we can maintain or maintain the situation within the Myanmar's government. We think that's the question that we have to answer. We think that international community intervention is important because we think that given the fact that the Aung San Suu Kyi government has no political incentive or even zero political incentive to actually really recognize there is a humanitarian crisis happening in northern Rakhine. What we see that at first when the crisis happened, Aung San Suu Kyi actually ignored or denied the existence of such an incident. But after that, even though she recognized such a thing happened, at least until this moment, there is no concrete solution haven't been put up by the table. And the thing that the reason why there is no concrete solution is that on one hand, she is controlled by the military junta, but on the other hand, she is being controlled or being controlled by the Western countries to deal with the Rohingya crisis. No, sit down. Therefore, we think that actually these Myanmar's government have no ability to actually handle the situation or even have no political incentive because whatever Aung San Suu Kyi does, he will die eventually. But more importantly, right on the principle level, why we believe that we believe that the international community owns a moral obligation towards these Rohingya community. First of all, we believe that openly talk a lot about how these people are suffering, and I think that all of us know how suffering they are. I'm not going to explain that. But then when we talk about the idea of sovereignty and the idea of your right to self-determine in the international community, we think that is a very crucial and fundamental right which each community have to argue. Even though closing opposition may want to come out and say, well, sovereignty is very important and you're infringing the Myanmar's government sovereignty. We think that sovereignty here is not absolute. Why? Because these Myanmar's government have no reciprocal duty towards this Rohingya community. Because what they have been doing to this Rohingya community is to exploit them and to suppress them, or even not providing basic standard of survival towards this community. We think that the form of reciprocal sovereignty doesn't really exist in this regard. We think that when a state fails to provide minimum standard of existence towards not only citizens but also people who are currently living within the state, we think that's why international community need to step in, and we think that this infringement of sovereignty is good. Moving on to my second issue, why we have to create a sovereign state? Sorry. Why do you think that a sovereign state is a solution to do? I think the upper half did talk about a lot of solutions. Like first of all, OG talked about how I think OG didn't really talk a lot on how the solution of having a state will help this Rohingya community. I'm going to explain to you what is the difference between having a state or just simply paying them or reallocating them everywhere in the world. No, sit down. First of all, we think that it's an effective way to actually send out humanitarian aid because currently all the aid towards this Rohingya community is being blocked by the Myanmar's government. But more importantly, right, we think that the establishment of a state means that there is an international recognition towards the problem that this community is facing. Right now, in the status quo, the reason why external intervention is so difficult because this issue has been characterized as a domestic conflict in which no other Western countries are able to really step in. But therefore, we think that the establishment of the state is the way how we can arouse at least other neighboring countries to step in and help these people. But why other current solutions doesn't really work? First of all, what are the current solutions? First of all, for instance, the first solution, a possible solution may be giving them citizenship in the Rohingya, which we think that apparently won't work. We think that in the past few decades, they haven't really granted Rohingya, and what they do is try to make them die. Second solution is what propose payment to other countries. First of all, we think that we don't think that other countries are held accountable towards this issue. First of all, secondly, we think that when we talk about allocation of a particular community, financial money is not the only concern. We also need to build infrastructure. We also need to, for instance, have many facilities to allocate. But at the end of the day, these countries will face a problem of capacity, and then we think there will also be underground discrimination and anti-refugee sentiment within these countries. And we think creating a state is a better solution because the international community can check and balance and to intervene and to send humanitarian aid to these states so as to help these Rohingya community. So for all these reasons, we are very proud to close.
All right, so those were the debates for the high school finals and the judges. You want to watch your message already? High school debaters, please go out orderly in an East Asian If it's a compliment, it's not everyone. It's a compliment. I said, go out and faster. Faster, faster. Andale, andale.
What this is a great intermission.
Yeah. This is kind of funny.
Yeah, it's just waiting. Go, 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 go.
Why should I be quiet, Steve?
You're alone. Yeah, this is nice. It's more spacious now.
Okay. Yay!
They're here. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. We agree that the problem that the opposition, our government side has provided, the Rohingya status today, is very important thing to the international community. But the answer to the problem is not the creation of the state or the massive military intervention to this kind of region that have massively failed in the historical sense, and that will fail when you consider the current context that Asian countries and these regions have been suffering from the tensions of religious communities and racial communities. We think it just triggers other form of very dangerous conflict in other states, such as Southeast Asia and such as South Asia, and we think is very important issue also in today's debate. Because when we talk about the interest or what the international communities do, we cannot just ignore, or we cannot just prioritize one particular group over the regional stabilities that can be undermined significantly by taking this kind of motions. And I think that was what was missing from the opening half of the debate. What the interest, or what the kind of things, or what the what does this action suggest to the rest of the world and rest of the region at the end of the day. So that I would like to extend from my from closing opposition. I have two things to tell you from my speech. First, about how this action of international community endangers actually it's not really somebody solving the problem, and how it endangers Rohingyas who already left this region to be exposed to the further attack by the local host communities, and how that's significantly harmful. But secondly, also about how minorities groups in other parts of South Asia, and how the regional stability will be significantly damaged by taking this proposal. So all the battles will be integrated in my speech. Let me first move on to my thing, right? So how this action of the international community actually damages Rohingyas who have already left. So we think that what happened, what's actually the context that the Rohingyas people have is that actually large scale of the Rohingyas have already kind of left this kind of state and actually going to Pakistan and south part of the Asia, and they are actually living in other nations, right? So we think what happens under their paradigm is that actually those people will be actually exposed to the most significant violence than ever than their other paradigm, right? Why? Because we think at the point in which there's a state that you can go back and you can get job there, what's the implication to the local host communities that host these people in, right? We think the perspective of these local people is going to be like, you can actually go back to your own nations, right? And we think that actually creates a narrative of the hatred against these communities people. And we think that those who have actually established their own life in Pakistan and Bangladesh will be exposed to extreme danger, right? We think that's significantly harm. But we think it's principally unjustified to allow this kind of things to happen. Because it's a double jeopardy, right? They have already left your country because they have been suffering. And the state that they actually, they settled, how actually will actually dissuade even more under the paradigm. But what they said on this is that this happens anyway, right? Opening government said the job is taken away, people will be actually discriminated. But we think it's far more likely to happen, given that the narrative of the state is actually the protection and like give jobs. That narrative is like enhanced furthermore. But secondly, more importantly, right? We think China has an active incentive to crush this state, right? They talked about from the perspective of how the Western, China's incentive to be anti-West, but they have another interest to secure the minority community in China, right? They have Uyghurs, they have Tibetans. They also want to actually be independent, right? We think at the point in which the international community tries to help these people out, what kind of implications that give to China, right? China will be aggressively against this kind of thing, and it will try to crush every possibility of the trade partner that this country have, right? We think that undermines significantly the regional stability, right? And let's analyze the conflict harbor mechanism. That was kind of slight and opening of a chat, right? We think that this action box Chinese domestic politicians into a very hard stances that require immediate response in a military manner. Because at the point in which this independence of the minority community can happen and the base of the Western state comes into this region, what happens is that the domestic politicians in China actually think that, oh, shit, right? Our and the West is going to put military bases on that point, right? You think that's a significant harm, right? Even if they said, right, Myanmar doesn't have an incentive to go to war. China, no, that's China, right? You think that's factually not. It's not about the incentive because it's about the situation of the extreme tension that these people have, right? Such as Russia and Turkey has a very nice relationship and a trading partner. But what happened in the last 2 or 3 years is that the airplane by the Turkey was actually shut down. Shut down by the Turkish government because of the high tension and high political tension of the domestic politicians going to be aggressive to this kind of military actions, right? You think therefore they're not really successful in making decisions, but the regional stability does really the opening.
Okay, if this is the case, why didn't China step up when we tried to help the Kurds in Syria or the Koreans in South Korea? Why haven't they done this any time as state?
Here.
Protection and military intervention is something that's different. The interest that they have, because there's an ISIS in Syria, and that's a different issue coming up, but that's answered by partner also. But secondly, right, minority groups in other parts of this region would be actually trying to pick up their arms to actually fight for their independence, how that undermines the regional stability. So we think the context of Asia harm is like many kinds of racial and religious conflicts, or not the conflict, tensions actually having going on, right? Such as Hinduism and Buddhism actually kind of have tension in South Asia, and we think those tensions will actually rise up resulting in conflict when we allow this intervention to happen, right? Because the incentive of these other religious community goes like, well, now the best way to kick the other party go from our nation is to discriminate them and to attack them so that the West people will come in and support these people for the establishment of other states, right? We think that gives a massive incentive for these communities to discriminate or have conflict over the other communities, right? We think that is something that will likely to happen under the environment. Secondly, we think it also make incentive of other minority groups to pick up the weapon to fight for their independence, right? We think that is likely to happen given the context that the Asia suffers from the tensions of these regions, right? So why is this a very important issue? Because none of the sides actually can consider what the international community should actually do. The question is, can international community prioritize this one particular group over the entire regional stability that can be undermined or that is likely to be undermined under their pattern? We think none of the sides actually have considered the role of international community, and then that's a significant loss of the debate, and that's the reason why this is being
for the speech. Okay, now we call government. Here.
Well, Honorable Chair, I want to firstly deal with the closing opposition before going to the more important issues in this debate, right? Because I think closing opposition's extensions majorly have twofold. Number one, those who have already settled in other states, you have devastate them. I think this idea is like this extension is not an important extension for a number of reasons. Number one, there are already a lot of international safeguards to prevent other states who have received a refugee to push him back to the original state. That's called naturalization. Right? So we have already have a lot of safeguards. Number two, given that most refugees who have gone to neighboring states like Pakistan or Bangladesh, they are not like settled there and get full citizenship there, right? They are still in a limbo and living on very basic, welfare and cannot live a full life, right? So we don't see that the idea of I've already have my life here that I'm forced to go back to Rakhine state. This thing will occur. But number three, even if there are some people who have settled in say Pakistan or Bangladesh and there's sentiment for them to go back, but we need to do the comparative, right? Because what they support as the status quo is that there are still like numerous people stuck in Rakhine state who are subjected to persecution of the Myanmar government every day, right? We think that on balance, we are even if there are like few settled people who may be asked to go back to this independent Rakhine state, at least we save more people at the end of the day. So I think this trade-off is okay. The second form of extension from that side of the house is about like China. I'm not sure why China is I'm not sure the role of China, why is it so big. But anyway, I'm going to address it, right? Number one, there is the situation of Rohingya people being persecuted by the Myanmar government is absolutely different from like other groups being other minorities in the state, because it is a very extreme example of the Rohingya people being persecuted when their basic citizenship has even been denied. So we don't see there will be a danger of any other like groups of minorities suddenly using it as an example and say, look, like the Rohingya can do it, then we can do it, because the situation is completely different, right? But number two, even from the perspective of China, it has an incentive to actually trade with a Myanmar where there's no conflict, right? China has been trying to explore its trade routes with like Southeast Asian countries. Given the fact that if this policy can lead to a more stable Southeast Asia, we think that China will be inclined to actually support this policy. So I think the closing opposition is out. So let's talk about the more important issues in this debate. I think the opening opposition majorly has the entire case on like the warfare will be very bloody and a lot of people will die, so it is a bad idea. But I think we question the idea, we question this fundamental premise, right? Because number one, the reason why the Rohingya people are persecuted in Myanmar is the very fact that they are in the Myanmar society and people see them, but people don't see them as insiders, right? Our policy is to give them an independent state, i.e. we prevent them from being in the group of people who don't like them. So we don't actually necessarily see that the Myanmar people will think that this is a bad idea in the first place. But number two, as I think the opening opposition has already acknowledged that like the land of Rakhine is like of very low value, right? And this group of people is the group of people that Myanmar does not want anyway, right? So we don't see that with a strong objection as to them ceding away from Myanmar in the first place. But number three, they've considered that the Myanmar government is actually a government that is afraid of sanctions. That means that if you can use monetary inducement or incentive to force them to give them citizens, which we think they likely will not, right? Because they have been they would rather see them die and die and have a lot of massacre them but not give them give them any sort of citizenship. We doubt whether they will actually, like, by giving them money, they will do that. But anyway, we think that if sanctions actually work in the operations of the Myanmar's government, then they will accede to the international community pressure to actually allow the Rohingya people to, be independent in the Rakhine state. So that falls back to our extension. Why statehood is a necessary instrument in this debate? Because we think that the alternative provided by opening opposition is absolutely unrealistic.
Sure.
Because the reason why the Rohingya people are persecuted is that people see them linguistically different, culturally different, and religiously different. So it's not something that when the government gives you citizenship, then suddenly the people on the ground will like you and treat you as neighbors, right? People still see them as outsiders. But what they are now doing is that they give money to a government that hates the people and ask them to protect the people.
Sure.
But the problem of sovereignty lies in here because of the fact that whenever the international community actually wants some accountability of whether your financial incentive have been put to good use, they have to go through the Myanmar's government first, right? Because this is a sovereignty principle that need respect. As opposed to under our paradigm, where the Rakhine state is an independent state, where the Rohingya people can actually have their own say, they do not need to go through the Myanmar's government, who always, even though there's still discrimination on the ground, there's still persecution on the ground, where the Myanmar's government may not be able to tackle, at least now you don't need to go through the government, but you can actually give direct help as long as the Rohingya people is willing to receive help. Go.
Saying the Rohingya will be popular, we're saying the junta can justify treating them better for selfish reasons because they get more money to help the people. Whereas you make these people the reason you got invaded.
Well, as I've already told you, they're not only persecuted by officials, right? Number one, I don't necessarily see that after receiving the money, then they will have a substantive, significant change of policy to treat them better. When historically, they've seen them, and the majority of the population do not necessarily see them as a welcome group. But number two, a lot of the persecution happens on the ground. Either individual citizens that kill them, throw stones at them, beat them up, right? These are not necessarily things that state have control. But if you want to give them money, you want to ensure that these things do not happen. But every time you need to go through the Myanmar's government, how do you check and balance on that? So let's talk about sovereignty as a matter of principle. The reason why a state has sovereignty over citizenship is because it fulfills an obligation to give you basic protection so that you can actualize yourself. In this particular context, we see that the Myanmar's government has completely failed its duty, so that there's absolutely no civil rights and no political rights on the part of the Rohingya people, and absolutely not recognized as a legal person at all. At this stage, we don't think the Myanmar's government has any sort of sovereignty over the Rohingya people, and it's a justified act for them to sit away from that in order to protect themselves and have their own say. At the end of the day, what do we see is that we don't see there's a bloody warfare under the but even if there is some warfare, we think it is still better in the long run for the very reason that because the international community is very likely to succeed at the end of the day, given the power imbalance, right? So at the long run, at least you have a safe place for the Rohingya people, so that the prolonged persecution under your house will not prolong, and the situation of unaccounted money going into the state, but the persecution going on will not happen. At the end of the day, we can save more people.
Here.
We think government whip for the speech. Okay. To end the debate, we'd like to call opposition whip. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at a tipping point in politics of South Asia and Southeast Asia. We're at a point in which racial and religious and ethnic tensions are higher than ever since the Cold War. We're at a point in which the outflow of Rohingya people have led to, for example, Thailand rejecting most Muslim refugees from that area from coming in because of the fear that there will be the racial and ethnic minorities within Thailand who will be empowered and will try to go against the majority Buddhists. There will be people, for example, in Sri Lanka, where people are protesting outside of the Myanmar, protesting outside of the Myanmar, what's it in English? embassy about people coming in to Sri Lanka as refugees. We've seen throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia that people are afraid that this sudden change in geopolitical violence will lead to outbursts of conflicts in India when it comes to Hindu and Muslim conflict, in Sri Lanka with the same diversity, in ASEAN countries, where in ASEAN there's the principle of non-intervention because we have Muslim majority countries and Buddhist majority countries, people of different ethnicities that are keeping balance, saying we shouldn't make this a regional conflict that will destroy our relationship. This policy, even if we were to say that this is at least becomes a functional country, triggers just that. It triggers a region-wide conflict in which more people, more minorities are oppressed, more minorities are told you should go back to your home wherever you came from, more deaths. We're not going to say that this is the solution to the problem in Rakhine. Okay, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to talk about why on their side of the house, everything that they've told us, taking that into account, will trigger exactly the problems that we've told you. Before that, quick response. So let's see what came out of the closing government, right? Closing government basically talked about, for example, there was zero incentives for Aung San Suu Kyi anyway. That's pretty much the same as opening government. Well, what interesting they said was self-determination, the principle of self-determination. These people should be able to choose. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, well, good. We'll give them citizenship precisely through the process given by opening government, right? We say that at the premise of this argument is that the minorities, because of their ethnic makeup, should be given a specific country, which is truly obviously not true, right? We have lots of countries with religious and ethnic minorities that do perfectly fine, even in a case where they have, for example, autonomous regions, and for example, Myanmar with all the other autonomous regions, right? So we don't really see the extension as to why, yes, they should have representation in government, but why their own state simply because they're an ethnic group, right? Secondly, they told us, well, we shouldn't kill, the reason why Myanmar will still keep attacking Rohingya is because there's linguistic and cultural differences, right? We have to look at reality, ladies and gentlemen. We're not, government tried to paint this as simply a Muslim versus Myanmar Buddhist sort of problem, which is obviously not true because it's only recently that the outburst of refugees into Bangladesh happened. Why is that, ladies and gentlemen? It's precisely because there was an escalation of conflict with the Rohingya extremist militants attacking Myanmar military bases, right? It's specifically that incident led to the escalation, as sort of a game of a chicken in a game, like game theory, if you will, right? It's basically in these situations that you have to recognize that it's gone beyond the point of just a clean principled justification to a point of I can't draw back now, right? It's precisely when you get the international community to come in and de-escalate the conflict, you get that solution, right? So we reject the idea that precisely because there's an ethnic divide, that leads to the conflict that they're painting on their side of the house, right? Okay.
Remember that you have to defend OO's counterplan, right? Why do you continue to reward the genocidal tendencies with paying off whoever the party is in power? Your same analysis is going to trigger that, and people are going to get paid off entrenching those power systems.
Well, we have to look at the comparative, right? We do understand that these people, people that we pay may not be angels, right? We may think that, okay, they may not, love the Rohingya as soon as we give them money, right? But at least what we do is we try to say, hey, we'll give you money so that now, because the international community says, we are going to step in and try to reconcile the heated tensions that we have now, you can draw out and you can pretend that you are, better than you would have been if you kept on killing these people. Right? That monetary incentive, an incentive to pull out of a conflict that you unfortunately had to be enrolled in because of the conflict, the escalation of conflict, can now be withdrawn, and now these people have a sort of a way to make an excuse and say, I'm going to pull out of this. Right? Okay, moving on. Okay, so let's talk about what my partner has said, because comparatively, she has said something very important that it's very important. Why is that? Why is that? Because the government side is saying, okay, we've got guns, we've got power, let's invade, let's implement this country, right? What happens? Number one, the ethnic Rohingya state is now fueled, within that country, is fueled by a rhetoric of revenge, right? where these individuals say, we're Rohingya, we've been attacked, now we should kill the Muslims, right? That's precisely the sort of the rise in tensions that my partner has illustrated. Secondly, we get the people in Bangladesh, we get the people in Sri Lanka to have more reason to say, you Muslims, you should go to Rohingya, whether or not they're Rohingya or not, right? Because at the point in which you create a state for the Muslims, you have people have an incentive to say, that's where the Muslims should go, right? It's precisely the same thing when the state of Israel was created. There was a rise in tensions against the Jews because now you could honestly say, hey, Jew, you should go to Israel, right? That's specifically the sort of thing that escalates the conflict in India, in Sri Lanka, the very thing that is leading to instability, right? Especially when we look at the context of India with Modi, Prime Minister, and rising Hindu nationalism, we say that there is more incentive for the Hindu nationalists to attack the Muslims within India and force them to go somewhere else, because there is somewhere else to go to, right? And secondly, my partner talked about China. They didn't understand why China was important. China is extremely important because the area around Rohingya and Myanmar is an important trade route for China, especially when they're trying to expand into the West with the new Silk Road, whatever thing that they're trying to do, right? We say that especially because China wants to maintain power around there, they have more incentive to not have a Western proxy there, to make sure that they have states that are friendly to China. Secondly, we say that there will be the dissolution of ASEAN. Why is that? Because precisely as I told you, the reason why ASEAN is taking a non-interventionist approach and not an approach where we have ethnic tension is precisely because ASEAN in and of itself is ethnically diverse, is religiously diverse. But at the point in which you try to pit Indonesia against Myanmar, when you try to pit Thailand against other Muslim countries within ASEAN, you don't get that cooperation within ASEAN, you don't get peace within the region. We're very happy to oppose.
We thank Opposition Whip and we thank all the speakers. Please go back to the
It's over.
somewhere. The audience also have to go out. Judges.